In March 1945, a single line buried deep in a War Department report defied all logic. German women prisoners permitted to enter town without escort. No guards. No chains, just trust, offered to those the nation still called enemies. It happened not in Europe, but in the heart of Illinois at a small camp named Donnelly. While bombs still fell across oceans, 5 women once loyal to the Reich walked freely into an American town. Their brief journey would expose something rare in wartime, the quiet power of mercy strong enough to challenge fear itself. It began as ink on paper, an unremarkable sentence lost among the bureaucratic thunder of a dying war. By 1945, the War Department produced statistics faster than men could read them, inventories of boots, rations, prisoners. Yet within one March report, a single sentence carried more weight than any battlefield dispatch. German female prisoners permitted to enter town without escort. To the clerks in Washington, it was a curiosity. To those who lived it, it was history whispering that even in war, trust might still have a voice. The camp mentioned in that report lay deep in Illinois farmland, surrounded by silent fields. Its fences were high, but its purpose quiet. Camp Donnelly was one of hundreds scattered across the Midwest, holding thousands of captured Germans, mostly men but a few hundred women as well. They were nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries captured when the Reich began to crumble. They had once marched to the rhythm of orders. Now they stood in lines beneath an alien flag, waiting for their fates to be decided. Among the guards were men too old for the front. Some had fought in the First World War and carried its ghosts in their eyes. They were tired of hatred, weary of slogans. Captain Robert Ellis, the camp commandant, believed discipline didn't need cruelty. His orders were simple: obey the Geneva Convention in both letter and spirit. The camp's duty, he said, was not revenge, but restraint. When Ellis's superiors read that same line in the official report months later, they wondered if he had lost his mind. In truth, he was testing whether mercy could survive war. The women who would one day walk unguarded through an American town began their journey in ruin. They came from the wreckage of France, from hospitals reduced to rubble, from convoys captured in retreat. In the final months of 1944, they were loaded onto Allied ships bound for a continent they'd only seen on maps. Fear traveled with them. German radio had promised horror, death camps, humiliation, starvation. None believed they would live long enough to see spring. But when the ships reached New York and Boston, the expected cruelty never came. Red Cross volunteers offered coffee and blankets. American MPs gave calm instructions in broken German. The women looked for mockery, for blows, but found only civility. It was disorienting. One prisoner, a nurse named Margaret, later wrote, "They looked at us not as beasts, but as people. I began to feel shame for the hatred I still held." From the ports, they boarded trains heading west. The journey carried them past small towns, rivers, and farmlands, stretching beneath enormous skies. Each mile took them farther from the war's smoke, deeper into a strange serenity. The guards, older men in pressed khaki, read newspapers, smoked, and said little. No one shouted. No one struck them. The rhythmic clatter of wheels replaced the sounds of bombs. When the train finally stopped at a siding marked Camp Donnelly, the women stepped into cold air that smelled of rain and soil. Ahead stood fences, barracks, and a flag they had once been taught to despise. Inside those fences, their world would shift in ways no propaganda had prepared them for. Camp Donnelly was not the prison they expected. The wooden gate bore a neatly painted sign. The barracks were lined in tidy rows. The fences were topped with wire, but flowers grew along the path inside. For women who had slept amid gunfire, it felt unreal, a dream built from discipline instead of terror. Captain Ellis met them at the gate. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, a man shaped more by patience than command. Through an interpreter, he said, "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated humanely. If you behave with honor, you will be respected." The words sounded rehearsed, yet something in his tone made them believe him. They were issued uniforms marked PW, assigned bunks with clean sheets, and served coffee strong enough to sting the tongue. The mess hall smelled of bread, real bread, not the sawdust loaves of rationed Europe. Many wept silently over their bowls. The next morning, the camp awoke to routine. The bell rang at dawn. Chores were assigned: kitchen duty, laundry, sewing. Work details filled the day. The guards were watchful but never brutal. Some spoke fragments of German learned from their grandparents. The women responded with polite English phrases, awkward at first but warmer with each day. By the second week, laughter returned, cautious, then genuine. The sound unsettled the guards at first. It felt wrong to hear joy from behind wire, yet as the days passed, they realized the laughter meant something larger than comfort. It meant that fear was fading. In Washington, reports described Donnelly as exemplary adherence to Geneva standards. But no report could capture what was truly happening. Hatred itself was starving to death. Spring thawed the fields around Donnelly, and with it the prisoners' suspicions. Each morning began with the clang of the mess hall bell and the smell of oatmeal and coffee drifting through open windows. The women worked in the sewing rooms repairing uniforms, tended vegetable plots, and sometimes helped the guards' wives bake bread. In the evenings, they sang softly in the barracks, hymns from home that carried across the wire like prayers. The guards, most of them farmers in uniform, began to see the women less as captives and more as neighbors. They spoke about weather, about crops, about families left behind. One guard brought his shepherd dog, Duke, into the camp. The animal became everyone's companion. When he stole a loaf from the kitchen, the laughter that followed felt like the first true moment of normal life either side had known in years. Letters were written and censored, but rarely destroyed. Many reached Germany through the Red Cross. In those letters, the women described something their families could scarcely believe: kindness. "We are treated well," one wrote. "The Americans feed us and speak politely. I wish you could see how calm it is here." Such words became quiet messages of another kind, proof that the enemy's humanity had survived. The camp choir practiced in the recreation hall. Locals driving by sometimes slowed their trucks to listen. Reporters who visited expected bitterness and found instead a strange serenity. One article noted, "Morale among the German women prisoners is high, perhaps uncomfortably so." Yet inside the camp no one called it morale. They called it peace, a fragile peace grown from small decencies. It would not remain unnoticed for long. Camp Donnelly's quiet experiment in humanity could not stay secret forever. By midsummer of 1945, word had drifted beyond the fences, through truck drivers, Red Cross visitors, and farmers who shared work with the prisoners. They told stories of German women who sang while picking corn, of captives who thanked them for water and waved as they left the fields. At first, the townspeople of Donnelly laughed at the absurdity of it. Then they began to ask questions. The war had taken husbands and sons from nearly every household. Families gathered each morning at breakfast tables covered with ration coupons, waiting for letters that sometimes never came. To those still grieving, the idea that enemy prisoners, German women no less, could stroll through open fields under friendly supervision felt like betrayal. The Donnelly Gazette received an anonymous letter that echoed the town's bitterness. "Why should the enemy eat our bread while our boys starve in foxholes?" It was a wound that decency alone could not heal. The editor printed the letter on the front page under the headline, "Are We Too Kind?" And the debate spread like wildfire through cafes, schools, and church pews. Some argued that humanity must survive war, or the victory meant nothing. Others spat that forgiveness was a luxury for the dead. Captain Ellis knew the temperature of his town was rising. He called a meeting in the high school gymnasium, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The bleachers filled with townsfolk, widows in black, farmers with caps clutched in their hands, factory workers smelling of oil and sweat. When Ellis stepped to the podium, the noise died. "They are prisoners," he began, "but they are not our sons' killers. They are women who served a dying government, as our own might have done if born elsewhere. We are bound by the Geneva Convention, and by conscience, to treat them with decency. If we abandon that, then what did we fight for?" The room fell silent. Some nodded. Others turned away. A widow in the front row whispered, "My boy never got decency." Ellis heard her but said nothing. There were no words large enough to bridge grief and mercy in the same breath. Still, by the meeting's end, no one demanded his dismissal. The people of Donnelly accepted reluctantly that their moral war would be fought at home now, not with weapons, but with restraint. The months that followed turned the camp into a laboratory of trust. At first, the prisoners' work outside the wire remained under armed watch. 2 guards for every 10 women, rifles slung but rarely lifted. The women harvested vegetables, sorted grain, and mended farm tools. They labored beside American families who learned slowly that the enemy looked and sounded like them. One farmer's daughter, barely 16, later recalled, "They sang while they worked, songs that sounded sad and lovely. I remember thinking how strange it was that enemies could sound like angels." By late summer, the first supervised trips into town were approved. Under escort, the women visited the general store, bakery, and post office to collect supplies for the camp. Their uniforms were plain gray with the letters PW stenciled in black. Shopkeepers served them in stiff silence. Customers stared. No one shouted. No one smiled either. Still, every visit ended quietly, without incident. Each week that passed chipped away at suspicion. A baker who had once refused to sell them bread began setting aside an extra loaf. A barber offered free haircuts for good behavior. The transformation was almost invisible, a gradual turning of hearts, one transaction at a time. Ellis recorded each success in his journal with the precision of a man who knew the world might one day doubt him. No incident. No resistance. Morale stable. The Red Cross inspector who toured the camp that August noted something even more unusual. Prisoner morale exceptionally high. Relations with local civilians improving. What no one could record was the feeling that had taken root inside those fences. An unspoken understanding that mercy could be a weapon more powerful than fear. Every loaf of bread, every polite word, every unguarded moment was proof that decency could disarm hatred more efficiently than bullets ever had. By early May of 1945, Europe itself was collapsing. Hitler was dead. The Reich dissolved. The news reached Donnelly on a warm morning, carried by radiostatic and disbelief. The women wept quietly in the barracks. They were free from the Reich, but not from captivity. Captain Ellis looked at them and thought, what now binds us to keep them behind wire except habit? It was then that a dangerous idea began to form. Captain Ellis had never been reckless, but he was a man who believed that discipline without purpose was cowardice. After weeks of peace and good behavior, he gathered his senior guards and said, "We're going to try something different." The room fell silent. He explained his plan. 5 women would be chosen, model prisoners who had shown patience, diligence, and respect. They would be allowed to walk the 1 mile from the camp to Donnelly's Main Street alone, unescorted, to purchase sewing materials and soap. The guards protested instantly. "Sir, if they run, it'll be on your head." Ellis's reply was quiet. "If we cannot trust them now, then we have learned nothing from this war." The next morning dawned bright and windless. The women stood at the gate in their gray uniforms, caps pulled low, clutching their passes stamped with the U.S. Army seal. The guards lined up silently. For a long moment no one moved. Then Ellis nodded. The gate creaked open. The 5 stepped forward into the sunlight. Beyond the camp lay a dirt road bordered by wildflowers. The fields shimmered green under the Illinois sky. Each footstep echoed like a heartbeat. The guards watched them shrink into the distance, gray figures swallowed by light. In town, shopkeepers froze when they entered. The bell above Dawson's general store door chimed once, breaking the silence. The first woman, her accent heavy, asked softly, "Soap, please." Old Mr. Dawson hesitated, then pointed to the shelf. She paid in ration coupons and coins, murmured, "Thank you," and left. At the bakery, another woman bought bread. The baker's wife, who had lost a nephew in France, served her without a word. But when the woman offered a careful smile, something inside her cracked. She said quietly, "Be safe back to camp." The woman nodded. By the time they reached the post office, the tension had lifted. Children peered through the windows. One waved shyly. A woman prisoner waved back, tears in her eyes. The world, for one fleeting hour, felt sane again. At sunset, they returned through the same gate, carrying parcels of fabric, thread, and soap. The guards stood at attention. Not one prisoner had run. Not one had broken trust. Captain Ellis wrote in his logbook that evening, "Experiment successful, no incident." But for those who had seen it, the meaning went far deeper. It was proof that trust could exist even in the ashes of war. The next day, the local newspaper printed the story. A young reporter had photographed the women walking past the bakery, sunlight spilling over their gray uniforms, the open for business sign crooked above their heads. The headline read, Enemy women allowed to shop without guards. Within days, the photograph was reprinted across Illinois, then in Chicago, then in New York. And with every reprint, the debate began anew. Was this mercy or madness? 2 days after the unguarded walk, the town of Donnelly awoke to see their story staring back at them from the front page of the Donnelly Gazette. The photograph was simple but unforgettable. 5 German women in pale gray uniforms walking down Main Street, sunlight slanting across the dusty road, their arms full of parcels. Behind them, the bakery sign tilted slightly in the wind. Open for business. The headline struck like a match. Enemy women allowed to shop without guards. By noon, copies of the paper had reached Springfield. Within 48 hours, the story had spread to St. Louis, Chicago, and New York. The image divided the nation more sharply than any frontline map. Letters flooded the Gazette's small office, some written in outrage, others in awe. One began, "Have we lost our minds trusting those who burned Europe?" Another countered, "If we must show the world our strength, let it be in mercy." Radio commentators debated it on air. Preachers quoted it from pulpits. For a moment, Camp Donnelly became a mirror in which Americans saw themselves. Their anger, their compassion, their confusion, reflected all at once. At the War Department, the reaction was less poetic. Telegrams arrived demanding explanations. A major in the Provost Marshal General's office scrawled a note in the margin of one memo. "Find out who authorized this insanity." Inspectors were dispatched to Illinois, expecting scandal. They found a camp immaculate in order, a commander calm and unapologetic, and prisoners who smiled shyly and asked in halting English whether they had done something wrong. The final report to Washington was as brief as the line that had begun it. Camp Donnelly. No incident, no escape. Discipline excellent. Morale high. But what could not be typed in a report was the intangible, the quiet change spreading beyond the camp. In towns and farmsteads, people began to speak differently about the enemy. The photograph had shown faces, not uniforms. It had forced Americans to look directly at their own mercy and ask whether compassion was weakness or the ultimate proof of victory. For Captain Ellis, the attention was unwelcome. He refused interviews, telling a reporter, "It wasn't news. It was just the right thing." But he knew the story had escaped the fences forever. In the weeks that followed, the War Department quietly shifted its stance. Without ever admitting it publicly, officials recognized that Donnelly's results could not be ignored. Across the country, other commanders began their own cautious experiments. Prisoners allowed to work on farms without guards, to attend church services in nearby towns, even to visit local markets under minimal supervision. The results were the same everywhere. No escapes, no revolts, no betrayal of trust. Instead, morale soared. Productivity rose. The Red Cross recorded a marked improvement in the psychological health of POWs across multiple camps. In Washington, one internal memo summarized it in cold bureaucratic terms. Humanitarian approach correlates with compliance and stability. But in truth, the policy shift was born not from calculation but from a rediscovered belief that decency could be strategy. Mercy, once dismissed as weakness, had become proof of moral strength. As one colonel wrote privately, "The way we treat their prisoners will decide how they treat ours." Meanwhile, back in Donnelly, life settled into a peaceful rhythm again. The outrage faded. Curiosity replaced it. Local children waved to the women on work details. Townsfolk brought lemonade to the fields in summer. The prisoners who once feared the guards now chatted freely with them over small talk of weather and family. One afternoon, as the women returned from the fields, Duke the camp dog bounded ahead of them, his tail wagging. A guard joked, "He doesn't know which side he's on anymore." A prisoner replied softly, "Neither do we." Both laughed, the sound of two worlds no longer divided. By autumn, the camp felt almost like a small village. The fences still stood, but the gates were rarely locked in daylight. Trust had become the rule, not the risk. When another Red Cross inspector arrived that October, his notebook contained an observation more philosophical than procedural. This camp demonstrates that humanity, once granted, reproduces itself. Winter returned, and with it came orders from Washington. All remaining prisoners were to be prepared for repatriation. Germany was defeated. The war was over. The women who had learned to live without fear would now be sent back to a homeland they no longer recognized. In early 1946, the buses lined up outside Camp Donnelly. Snow dusted the roofs of the barracks. The American flag hung limp in the still air. The guards assembled by the gate, their breath forming white clouds. Inside the dormitories, the women packed what little they owned: a Bible, a folded blanket, a pressed flower kept from the camp garden. Some carried letters from local families. Others clutched trinkets carved by guards during the long winter nights. When the first bus engine rumbled to life, Captain Ellis stood by the gate, his hat in his hands. The women filed past in silence. One paused before boarding, looked at him, and saluted in the German way. Then she hesitated, switched to the American salute, and smiled through tears. Ellis returned the gesture, unable to speak. The buses rolled down the road until the sound of their engines faded into the horizon. The camp exhaled one last breath of smoke from the chimneys, then went still. Within weeks, the fences came down. The barracks were dismantled for lumber. The fields were sown again with corn. Nothing remained but a weathered wooden sign. Camp Donnelly, 1944-1946, years passed. Letters began to arrive from across the Atlantic, thin envelopes bearing German postmarks. "We remember how you treated us," one read. "You helped us believe we could rebuild." Another wrote simply, "When we were your prisoners, we learned what freedom might feel like." Some of the women went on to become nurses, teachers, mothers. A few returned to America quietly after the war, drawn by memories of safety they could not explain. The guards who had once watched them aged into old men who spoke rarely of what they'd done, but kept the memory folded in their hearts like a secret medal. Historians later searched the archives and found little: a handful of reports, a faded photograph, a few diary pages, but together they told a story too clear to ignore. The humane treatment of prisoners in America had not only shaped post-war policy, it had reshaped the idea of victory itself. Mercy had proven to be the last and most enduring act of power. Today, Camp Donnelly exists only as farmland. Tractors cross the same soil where barbed wire once gleamed, but when the evening light falls just right, locals say you can still imagine the shapes of barracks, the echo of voices singing across the wind. No monument marks the place. No plaque tells its story. It lives instead in the memory of those who heard it. In the old photograph yellowing in an archive box. In the letters saved in drawers, in the notion that even in the darkest of wars, trust can still be stronger than fear. They came as prisoners, carrying the weight of propaganda and guilt. They left as witnesses, proof that mercy can survive conquest, that compassion can endure even when empires fall. And somewhere between the ink of an old report and the soil of a forgotten field, the truth remains that freedom once given in faith never truly dies. If stories like this move you, if you believe that history's quiet moments can teach louder lessons than its wars, then remember Camp Donnelly. Share its story, speak its name, and keep its mercy alive. Because every generation faces its own kind of war, and every time we choose trust over fear, we keep that small miracle of 1945 from being forgotten. Mercy once given becomes our inheritance, and it is ours to defend.